Is that all there is? Some of you, like me, are old enough to remember Peggy Lee's famous song from 1969, Is That All There Is? If that's all there is, then let's just keep dancing and have a ball. Is that all there is? I was thinking about that classic popular song this week as I took a look at the gospel reading and found myself at a very poignant moment. Jesus' last meal with his dearest friends on the night before he died. Gathered with them as imminent death hung over the gathering. And I noticed in that reading that after the meal, he turned to his disciples and it would appear in the quietest way possible. He said to them, "Little children, I give to you a new commandment, that you love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So I say to you, is this all there is to a commandment? An eternal, abiding, everlasting commandment from God? Well, I thought commandments came on the mountaintop with thunder and lightning, fire and brimstone, and they were etched in stone. Thou shalt not kill. This all seems so inconsequential, so quiet. Little children, I've got a commandment for you. Love one another. The inconsequential, the ambiguous, the nebulous, the substanceless nature of that commandment, given at the end of his life, is exacerbated in the intellectual mindset of 21st century Westerners, Americans. Because for us, when we hear the word love, we think about phrases like, love makes the world go around. Speaking of songs, love is a many splendored thing. Or in the words of those incredible four lads from Liverpool, all you need is love. And that's too bad. Our culture is awash with facile, superficial notions of love. So, being an indefatigable preacher of the gospel, I immediately, in preparation for today's sermon, rushed to Webster's New World Dictionary and looked up the word love to define it for you for purposes of Jesus' commandment. And I found four definitions. 1, an intense, affectionate concern for another person. 2, a passionate attraction to another person. 3, a strong like or enthusiasm for something, e.g., his first love is kayaking. Maybe we're now talking about real love. 4, a 0 score in tennis. Little children, love one another. Is that all there is? Is that all there is to love? Well, remember, this is Jesus we're dealing with here. Jesus never operates simply on the surface of things. Jesus is always challenging people. And in fact, if you notice, Jesus is not a fellow who's out giving a lot of commandments out like confetti. You don't really hear him giving commandments. You hear him challenging people to go deeper in their apprehension of the faith, right? So Jesus, apparently, when he issues his commandment at the Last Supper, as inconsequential as it might sound, given the absence of fire and brimstone, he said, in his exact wording, after he said, I give you a commandment to love one another, he adds, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. Just as I have loved you. Just as I have loved you. You ought to love one another. In other words, that's how deeply the love sinks into you that I'm calling forth from you. The word in the Greek in John's Gospel to which Jesus is referring is agape. Self-giving, sacrificial, undeserved, unlimited love. That's the commandment. And he's calling on his disciples then and now to love one another with just such unselfish love. He wasn't talking about love as a feeling, a sentiment. He was talking about love as it forms human action in a person's life. And when you love in this way, when you really let Jesus' commandment go deep inside of you, transformation occurs. Transformation in behavior occurs. Transformation in whole institutions occurs. Transformations in local parish churches occurs. Back in 1965, the Reverend Elias Shakur, a native of the Galilee region in what had recently become the state of Israel, returned to his hometown, having gone to seminary and been ordained to the priesthood. Elias was a local boy of Galilee, a Palestinian Christian. And when he returned to his home, his little village of Ibaline in Galilee, he found things there in turmoil and decline. The state of Israel had been formed just a few years earlier, and the Palestinian population was divided and distraught over how to respond to this new reality. And Elias Shakur found his church in just a state of decline and division. The little church to which he was assigned was divided by hatred over the course that the people ought to take in responding to the new circumstances. And the hate and discord in that little church was centered around two brothers who were leaders in the community of Ibaline, two brothers who were leaders in the local church of Christian people, two brothers who hated one another so deeply that they even refused to go to their mother's funeral because they didn't want to be in the same room, that is, the same church building with one another, even on that occasion. Deep, abiding hatred. So Elias Shakur appears for his first Sunday in the village church. It happened to be on a Palm Sunday. And he looked out at the congregation and he saw that hatred and that fear and that disgust etched on the faces of most of the people in the deteriorating church building. As he watched those faces and he experienced that turmoil, he was moved to do something that had never occurred to him before. Elias Shakur, looking at the congregation, looked down at his feet for a moment and went to the back of the church. And he closed the church doors, and he found a padlock and a chain that was used to lock the church during the week, and he locked everybody inside. And then he walked back up to the front of the church and he says, I am not going to stand here in a Christian church and subject myself to the divisions of hatred and distrust and decline that I see being exhibited by the people who call them Christians in this building. So we're just going to sit here for a few minutes and see if we can't rectify this situation. So he went back and he sat down, and there was silence, absolute shocked, embarrassed silence for more than 10 minutes. More than 10 minutes. And then suddenly, one of those two brothers stood up with tears running down his cheeks. And he said to the gathered congregation, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I haven't been the brother I should have been. I haven't been the Christian I should have been. I've hated my own brother. And I'm a Christian. I'm called to love. Please forgive me. The other brother got up and made a similar apology in front of everyone. They raced to the center of the church, hugged one another, and collapsed in tears after all those years. After that moment, Eli Shakur went to the back of the church, unlocked the doors, and announced to the congregation, this is Palm Sunday, but we're going to celebrate Easter. Christ is risen, and so are we. Let's go tell the world. And the congregation, led by those two brothers, arm in arm, stormed out of the church and celebrated Easter in the streets of the village. And that's what happens when Christians fundamentally and genuinely respond to that little last commandment that Jesus gave on the night before he died. When they find ways to love one another as he loved them. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. Well, I've got some really good news for you this morning, just in case you're wondering. I'm not going to go back there and padlock the doors of the Church of Christ Church. You don't have to worry about that. But I am going to ask you to time travel with me just a minute here, back to the year 200 AD. 200 AD, as we consider the words of a person who's known as one of the church fathers, the early theologians and writers of the church, a person we know under the name Tertullian. Tertullian. His real name was Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus, which is why we remember him as Tertullian. Well, anyway, Tertullian was from North Africa, and he was not a Christian. He was a follower of a local religion, but he came to faith in Christ. He was attracted to the church, and he became an eminent early proponent and writer and expositor of the faith. He's remembered throughout the world now, Tertullian. And one thing he said and wrote after he witnessed what the Christians were doing in responding to their Lord's commandment to love one another, he wrote, "Come and see how these Christians love one another." Come and see how these Christians love one another. I want to say to the world, come and see how the Christians at Christ Church love one another. When one of them gets sick with COVID, and unbeknownst to anybody, a full meal shows up for 3 nights in a row, come see how they care for one another in times of sickness, weakness, suffering, and grief. Come see how they care for young people. Come see how they reach out generously to folks they don't even know who are suffering. Come and see. So I'm not going to go back here and padlock these doors today, but what I am going to do is make sure that they're wide open. I want to make sure that these doors back here are wide open because I want people to come and see how these Christians love one another. I want the world to know what we found here, what we share here, what we have here. And I also want those doors open because I want the Christians who are gathered here to be able to rush out into the world to share that love with others, Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another.